Polish Tavernkeepers. Sure, we've talked about them previously, about 18th and 19th century Jews who kept taverns in Poland. But guess what? There's a lot more to check out as we dive more deeply into this topic on episode 123 of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome back, second-time guest of the show, Professor Glenn Dynner. Professor Dynner, welcome.
Thanks. It's actually pronounced Diner, but that's okay.
Dynner, I should have learned from the first time. All right, Professor Dynner, I'm very excited to have you back. For those less familiar with Professor Dynner, he is currently the director of the Bennett Center and chair of Judaic Studies at Fairfield University, and previously he was teaching at Sarah Lawrence College in his previous appearance on the show, which was episode number 12, which came out in January 2020, and he is also the winner of a 2019-2020 Guggenheim Fellowship, and he earned his PhD from Brandeis University in Jewish Studies. And he's had how many books now?
I just sent off my manuscript for my third book today.
Very exciting.
So we're at almost 3.
Awesome. And the second book is certainly a topic of the 12th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. We talked about Jewish Tavernkeepers in Poland in 18th and 19th century. And obviously listeners are welcome to go check and revisit that episode. So we're talking today about
getting more the lives of individual Jewish tavern keepers and trying to understand much more from a personal perspective what it to have this occupation, which was so popular, so pervasive throughout Eastern Europe, what it meant for men who were running taverns and for women who were running taverns, sometimes together in interesting, divided responsibilities.
Yeah, I recently recorded with a guest who, it's one thing to talk about these things from a very like 30,000 foot in the sky sort of view, but it's a lot more tangible when you can talk about individuals, almost like the microhistory aspect. And certainly people's own stories and their lives. It's more, I don't know, it takes a greater hold of us.
I think we have a lot of stereotypes about East European Jewry. Fiddler on the Roof is a great musical with great songs, but just give you a kind of a stereotype of that lifestyle. Not that there weren't dairymen like Tevye and rabbis and that kind of a thing, but really leaves out is the most popular and pervasive Jewish occupation throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and really earlier centuries as well, which is the production and sale of liquor, what I call tavern keeping for the sake of simplicity.
What do you mean most popular?
Meaning that about half the Jewish population was engaged in the production and sale of liquor.
Wow.
And they didn't run taverns. Really, they would lease them from the nobility. They didn't own them. They leased them. And we can think about why that was actually better. Certainly protects you against having your tavern burned down by disgruntled customers. And, it's really under the protection of the nobility. But even who didn't lease a tavern themselves or sublease a tavern, they would often turn their own homes into taverns on Christian holidays. And well,
that's great.
It was so pervasive and not really talked about because it's probably a little bit of a source of embarrassment. It's not the most noble pursuit in some people's opinion, and it was admittedly a very rough and tumble way of making a living that if you were in rural areas also kind of challenged your piety and your practice of Yiddishkeit,
I have so many questions. Well, let's just go into that last one. How does it challenge, what's so rough about it, and how does it challenge one's Yiddishkeit, especially in the more rural environments?
Contrary to popular belief, I suppose, Jews did not tend to reside in villages. Depending on the time period, it was around maybe 15-20% of the Jewish population. Jews prefer to live in towns and cities, urban centers, where they could minyan, where they could have a steady, not just a synagogue, but a sort of steady source of various religious functionaries, scribes and butchers, kosher butchers, tailors who knew what shatnez means. So you need a whole infrastructure. You can't really get that in a village, but sometimes that was the only place where the economic opportunities were, especially the tavern, right? So the rural tavern becomes a very popular rural Jewish pursuit, but you're really living there as the only Jewish family in the midst of these Gentile peasants, and your children are growing up around the Gentile peasants. They're the only ones they have to play with. The school isn't obviously acceptable unless you can find a tutor. And where are you going to go to find a minyan? So often they'll only go into town for a minyan on Jewish festivals, on high holidays. And so it's a really challenging situation the rabbis felt extremely ambivalent about. At the same time, as is always the case, they have to deal with the social reality. And the social reality is that Jews, needed parnassa, make a living.
Wow. And you also mentioned the rough and tumble aspect. Is that related to the ruralness or not necessarily so?
I would say so, because the rural taverns tend to be less regulated by police. There's a lot of inter-ethnic tensions going to emerge because you really only have Jewish tavern keepers in the countryside. And so everybody's in their kind of predetermined economic role and really social role as well. The Jew running the tavern and selling it to the peasant Christian, who's usually a farmer, and ultimately the power resides with the noble, who's more absent than not, who is the owner of the tavern. So you have this triangular relationship, which gets even more complex when you get into Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian areas, where there's a serious division, divisiveness between the locals and the Polish noble, who even religious differences, to us, it might not seem like a huge difference between Eastern Orthodox or Uniate peasants and their Polish Catholic nobles, but to them, of course, that made all the difference in the world. There's also linguistic differences, and here are the Jews running these taverns, trying to mediate between these often very different and mutually resentful groups. The Poles were essentially colonizing these areas further eastwards. They were by and large, let's take Ukrainian territories. These are Ukrainian majorities who are under the dominion, under the control of Polish nobles. And here, Jews as a diaspora group trying to mediate. And of course, they're physically vulnerable, the Jewish diaspora, as stateless diasporas always are, almost always are. So they gravitate towards the stronger party, the nobles. So they're seen actually as enabling the nobles, as part and parcel of the nobility. And when it breaks down, when there's some sort of an uprising, as happened in 1648, or some sort of an inter-ethnic tension, Jews are not only caught in the middle, they're seen as the accessible kind of target. You can't kill a nobleman, but you can definitely more easily attack a Jew. And that get these massacres that happened in 1648, where like a third of the Jewish population is wiped out, half of the Jewish population in Ukrainian territories. And a lot of it has to do with that local kind of ambivalence that's involved in the running of a tavern, because on the one hand, the Jewish tavern keepers are providing all these services and goods. They're the only entertainment in town. They're the restaurant and so on. And you need their services. They mediate between the peasants and the nobility. On the other hand, they're foreign in a sense, and they're seen as uppity, as too powerful for an group. And they're seen lording it over Christians. And this is totally acceptable in a lot of people's eyes, but they can't say anything until, of course, it all breaks down and violence begins.
Although we probably discussed this before, but how much, you mentioned there was such a significant part of the Jewish population involved in some shape or form with the trade. Was that a large part because of having other professional avenues being closed off, or what was the cause of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Jews
Mhm.
cannot land in most cases.
Mhm.
Jews cannot lease land, and the same psychological I'd say social psychological problem of not being able to bear the optics of Jews sort of ruling over Christians who would work the actual land. It was unacceptable, and therefore Jews are kind of kept out of agriculture. Plus, to be honest, not many Jews want to enter agriculture because, again, you need a whole community. You can't be living isolated in the country easily. Of course, rural tavern keepers did this, but it wasn't the number one choice. And, farming was even more difficult. And, the Jewish population is literate. So why would you want to try to make your living off the land if you can engage in slightly more lucrative urban pursuits? And so there are all kinds of reasons why Jews were not engaged in agriculture, which is, probably 85% of the country that's doing this.
Wow.
And, Jews are kept out of governmental posts unless they're censors. And if they're censors, they're seen as sort of collaborators with the government bureaucracy. They're not loved by the Jewish communities. So really, those Jews are concentrated in trade. They become merchants, whether it's small scale or international merchants. They become craftsmen, artisans, especially tailors and butchers, because of the religious requirements, right? The shotness and kashrut. Or they become leaseholders, and most leases are taverns. They can also be mills. They can also be fish ponds and tolls on roads and highways. But the most lucrative and popular lease is a tavern and distillery. Usually they're together, actually. And they're monopolistic, right? So you don't have to worry about competition as much because you're given this 3-year lease that Nova will protect against any competitors. And then, the Jewish community will actually protect it as well, because they don't want other Jews driving up the price by trying to outbid tavern. So the whole system kind of really funnels Jews into tavern keeping, and liquor is the drug of choice,
Wait, can I ask a quick question? So these taverns, so I know that when we think about taverns, we think about drinking, which is, of course, that's what we're here for. I'm curious also to hear about two other activities. One is food, or I should say services or goods, which is food and also lodging. How much were the taverns exclusively about the drinking, or were there food and also lodging opportunities offered?
They're usually offering these other things as well. And yes, the food was kosher, and it was also kosher for Passover, because the Jewish merchants really had to feel like they could eat in an establishment. And what's about that is when the legislation made it more and more expensive and difficult for Jews to run taverns, some Jews, especially in rural areas, converted to Christianity so they wouldn't have to pay the special licensing fee, the consent. And that seemed like a great idea until they found that no Jews would frequent their tavern. Out of any kind of animosity towards their decision to convert, apparently it only had to do with the fact that they were suspected of not selling off their chametz, their leaven during Passover, and not dealing with their implements properly on Passover. Luckily, according to Jewish ritual law, they are considered still to be Jews, right? So it would kill their business when they would convert. It's a very interesting thing that happened.
It's definitely intention. How much, I mean, since they're kosher, And it's, if you're traveling for business or for, who knows, maybe you're traveling to see a family member. And those must have been really interesting sites of conversation or exchange of information or ideas. Do you have much of a sense of how much that happened?
Yeah, I mean, they were really the only places where news was exchanged. You're not supposed to be talking in church, but you can do all the talking you want in the tavern. And so there's this real tension also between the church and the local tavern, and the priest and the Jewish tavernkeeper as the kind of anti-priest. Every Sunday after church services, there would be a mass migration to the tavern. Wow. And how you spent your Sundays. Same with weddings, same with funerals. So Jews, again, is a very ambivalent kind of role, but it's necessary. It's vital to local life. And so the Jewish tavernkeeper was both resented and respected as indispensable. It's not just men, the women, the wives of tavernkeepers were very much respected for the advice that they would provide, the making skills they had among Christians. And often, I found
I wonder how much of that is, alcohol serves as a social lubricant. So people are opening up. Maybe sounds like they're looking for dating or match opportunities.
I'm sure the alcohol plays a role, but really there were these folk sayings: when in doubt, go to Sarah. And Sarah is the tavernkeeper or the Jewish tavernkeeper's wife, right? So there really was built into this local life this role for the Jewish tavernkeeper that was age old. So when they tried to, abolish it, it was very difficult. When the government, from the outsides, they seemed like intrusion. They seemed like intruders on local traditions when they would drive Jews out of the liquor trade. Now, when a Jewish tavernkeeper would pass away, his wife knew how to run the tavern still and keep it going. So a lot of widows were female widows were tavernkeepers as well. Divorcees were tavernkeepers. But the typical sort of heteronormative situation is that the husband and wife would run the tavern together. And during a lot of the time, the husband would sort of run a taxi service with his horse and cart.
Oh, really?
While the wife and daughter would stay behind and serve the customers. And you can imagine how this sometimes be a dangerous situation.
Vulnerability.
But they handled it. These women became very adept at throwing out the drunks and very careful track of their drinking debts. And nobody needs to pay drinking debts. So this also would sometimes involve bringing in police, that with the help of the nobility to collect drinking debts. And again, there's that ambivalence, so the whole system is very tense. It's like together.
So before we get into that, it almost sounds like it fulfills multiple functions or needs. Obviously the need to drink, or I would say the opportunity to drink. But what you were suggesting earlier is it's a site of information, news sharing, ideas sharing, maybe opening up, matchmaking, who knows, maybe other business opportunities. So in addition to this sort of advice dispensing from the tavernkeeper's wife, I mean, even just it's a good space all around.
Yeah, I would say everybody looked positively upon the tavern, except of course the clergy, the priests. So temperance movements, which ostensibly were trying to, cut down on the drunkenness, what today we call alcoholism. It also had a very anti-Semitic edge to it.
Just like in America.
Yeah.
Wait, can I have a quick question? So I know in America, I don't know about temperance beyond America. In America, it rose in the 1820s, 1830s, and really for a century until, the Volstead Act, 1922 and 1920 and so forth. But was that happening in Poland also in the 19th century?
Yes, late 19th century. In fact, it's believed that the entire country is debilitated by drunkenness. Poland will never achieve its independence from Russia and Austria until we get this drinking problem under control. through temperance, and it's all the fault of the Jews, of course. Because
I have to just throw in a note. I'm not saying we're going to solve it, but I'm just shocked. I knew about America reading Marnie Davis's Jews and Booze book in the 1820s and even 1870s, 80s. There was a lot of drinking in America, like mind-blowing amounts. France also, especially the 1870s, 80s, there was just mind-blowing amounts of drinking going on, especially when the wine crop started going bad and they turned to absinthe. So this is happening in Poland. Like, was there something just going on I can't just say the West, but the late 19th century, there was just massive drinking going on.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with the technology. You can distill much stronger and cheaper vodka.
Mm-hmm.
Beginning in 1827, there are apparatuses, liquor distillery machinery.
The stills
that are brought in from Germany, or new technologies, and so it becomes much stronger and more addictive and cheaper. The importation of the potato, which you can grow a lot more of.
That only happened in the 19th century.
And so,
did that only happen in the 19th century, or was that 18th century?
Beginning in the 1820s and 30s,
oh wow,
potatoes start to replace the rye that's being to make vodka with, but that only lasts until 1847, when the potato blight wipes out not just Irish potato crops, but crops throughout Europe. And it really, luckily for Poles, the potato was only introduced very late, so they didn't have a devastating effect.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in and give you a sneak peek into this really interesting deep dive into Kiddush clubs. Yeah, we've talked about them before, but here's a little bit more in this sneak peek to next week's episode.
Spending time together in the same room, drinking and eating together, creates a social circle that confirms the group identity and individual social status.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode on Polish Tavernkeepers.
There were several major uprisings. The main Polish uprisings against the Tsar were in 1830 and 1863. There was an 1848 uprising in Galicia as well, which is Austrian Poland. So you did have 1848. Invariably, the tavern plays a key role because it's a place where the troops will come. That's the first stop, where they try to get the tavern keeper, usually a Jewish tavern keeper, to spy on their behalf.
Oh, wow.
Him with all kinds of terrible things if he doesn't agree. And then the other troops, the insurrectionists or whatever the opposing army is, they come in and they also want the Jewish tavern keeper to spy on their behalf. And it puts the Jewish tavern keeper in a very difficult and dangerous situation. And many are executed as suspected spies. The best they can hope for is neutrality, but nobody's going to let you be neutral. So it really becomes tragic in certain cases. But in most cases, it was after the end of the uprising. I found in the archives all these petitions by tavern keepers who were either asking, when the Russians put down the insurrections of the Poles, they were asking to be rewarded. And some people openly admit that I spied on behalf of the Tsar, and now I'd like to have a liquor concession as my reward. Always a liquor concession.
Really?
Incredible.
Wow.
Or I was falsely accused of spying on behalf of the Poles, because the Poles lost, they have to claim they falsely were accused. Here's one petition I just want to read to the Tsar's authorities. I'm 88 years old. I live like an elderly person, led a life without any complaints, and never sent a complaint to the government when I worked as a tavern keeper, selling state liquor in the city of Warsaw. And then at the peak of my life, when my days were already numbered, my concession for selling state liquor was revoked. At a time when my old age deprived me of physical strength, and when I was no longer able to start any new enterprise, I lost my means of making a living. And he goes on to claim that he learned he had been, quote, denounced by another Jew, apparently, who wanted to take over my concession, my liquor, by accusing me of aiding Polish rebels. In reality, he probably was aiding Polish rebels, but this is an excuse. But you get this, on both sides. The point is the Jewish Tavernkeeper, and by the way, I have to point out, this is such a controversial topic among Polish historians and even Polish popular culture, because it links up with the New Testament image of Judas, right? As the Jewish betrayer of the Polish cause, of the Tsarist cause. Jews, being accused of being a betrayer. In reality, though, if we look at it according to the scenario that I sort of proposed in the beginning, as members of a diaspora group caught between this, Tsarist government, the colonizers, and then the Polish insurrectionists and the rest of the Poles, the peasants, Jews are in a very, very precarious position, and they're going to try to serve the more powerful group, but during insurrections, that becomes very unclear, who's the stronger group, and whoever you serve, you could potentially pay a deadly price, a full price for that choice. So the best you could hope is that the insurrection just blows over. You don't really care which side wins in a lot of cases. There were Jews who were very fervent Polish patriots or loyal to the Tsar, but many just were trying to survive. And I think it's understandable. It's silly. It's really silly when Polish historians argue over were Jews loyal or not, to the Polish cause. And
that's something you've experienced in the last 2-3 decades of what's going on in Polish historian stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of that is like, how do we retell the Holocaust in a way that makes Poland look less bad? And it gets very, very tricky because you have politicians trying to control what historians are writing, and then you have historians who are sometimes actually acting irresponsibly, and then claiming the mantle of martyr when they're sued and whatever. It's a very complicated situation where it's unfortunate. I mean, the politicization is a very, very bad thing for history,
even to this day, which is pretty wild. Wow.
Yeah. So really, all you can do as a historian is try to stick to the sources. And what I found, unfortunately, is there's no clear picture. There were Jewish tavernkeepers who played both sides, or who allied themselves to Poles and hid Polish nobles and saved their lives, or worked on behalf of the Tsar and smuggled and even spied on their behalf. And there's really no single story we can say about Jews, because again, they're a vulnerable diaspora group. What do you expect? And
self-preservation is important.
I mean, self-preservation is not just important, it's actually
paramount.
Yes, it's paramount. So there's really nothing you can do. But what's interesting is that I did find cases, even though the Tsar's side, the Tsarist forces are victorious in both uprisings, I did find indications of Jews really, really risking their lives to fight on the side of the Polish insurrectionists. And it's interesting because they never really had a guarantee of emancipation. You're basically fighting for one group or another without, yes, they'll hold out the hope that you will have equal rights after all this is, but there's no real guarantee. And so you're asking non-citizens, Jews as non-citizens, to take your side. That's why the whole debate is so ridiculous sometimes.
Wait. So what was the Jews were not Polish citizens?
Jews were not Polish citizens. They were not emancipated. And in fact, Jews in Tsarist territories are not emancipated until 1917, the Russian Revolution. I mean, you can argue that they were partially emancipated, which they were in 1862, as a way of sort of staving off Jewish participation in one group or the other. The Tsar did offer them partial emancipation, but it was very restricted. Land ownership was still heavily restricted. University attendance, you couldn't become an army officer, and so on and so forth. So it was very, very limited. I would not call it emancipation, although some Polish apologists have tried to call it emancipation.
Hey there. I wanted to break in again. And just last month, I went out to a couple different places beyond Cincinnati. Pretty crazy, right? And they enjoyed my content here. Hopefully you're enjoying the content here. And they said, we want to have Rabbi Drew come to speak to our folks, to our shul, and talk about Jewish wisdom on drinking, talk about the whiskeys, talk about tastings, and more. And that's exactly what I did. I think they enjoyed it quite well. And if you're interested in bringing me to bring L'chaims to life, feel free to email me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you. Now back into the show.
But I mean, some of the most, we're talking about like these more intimate stories. I mean, some of these really the most compelling and personal accounts came from this trove of petitions to Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, who lived until 1873. So this is after the uprising. And that's where you have Jewish Tavernkeepers writing kfitlich, petitions to non-Hasidic miracle worker, Gutmacher, who lives in the Russian part of Poland at this time. And that's where I got like a lot of these personal stories from both men and women who are running taverns. And that's some of the most exciting thing. And what I will tell you is it was anxiety provoking in every way imaginable to be running a tavern. The peasants were envious. They didn't want to be farmers forever, certainly not the younger generations. They wanted to run taverns too. But I'm telling you, it is the most, if you read these petitions, it's the most anxious occupation you can imagine, especially for Jews, because it's...
Do you want to share a few?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, look, let me just summarize that. I mean, sure. You have legislation that now from the state that makes it illegal for you to run a tavern unless you get an expensive concession. So there are a lot of illegal taverns, technically illegal. Where at the local level, everybody's covering for the Jewish Tavernkeeper, but sometimes the state will discover it and intervene. So you've got that anxiety. You've got the anxiety of informers. Your enemies could inform on you, whether Jewish or non-Jewish. You have the problem of your noble tavern owner dying, passing away, and the son hates Jews, or wants to change the terms of your contract. You have the ongoing problem of violence from the peasantry, and the nobility is getting weaker. They're heavily in debt. They're being economically ruined in some cases. They're moving to towns and cities, and the Jews are being deprived of their main protectors. So all of this background to these petitions, which are really, really, I would say incredible. For me, the most interesting ones are sometimes by women who are trying to run taverns after they passed away. And, I'll read you just one of them.
Absolutely.
So here's one by Sarah Batfega. And she asks for a blessing for her daughter Miriam and her daughter Shosha. And she says, may the Admor, which is an honorific for the miracle worker, usually Hasidic honorific. May the Admor pray for livelihood for me and success, for I have a tavern, and it's insufficient for all my needs to support me and also Miriam, her daughter, who has been in a shidduch for a whole year, a marriage match for a whole year, and is not helped to pay the dowry of 1,000 zuzim. Now, I don't know how you define a zuz in this case. It's probably just zlotys, Polish currency. And also, I, Sarah, was a widow for 1 year and a half and married a widower, but he was a drinking man and he loved to play cards and other things. So I divorced him. She divorced him through the Beis Din. through the rabbinical court. According to the suit, however, I must pay half of the get, the divorce agreement. And debts that I'm owed by money lending, because all of these tavern keepers were money lending on the side too. Debts I'm owed amount to 105 rubles, but I did not give it to him because there was not enough time to collect the sum. And now he wanders from place to place and I have to provide his meals. So here you just have this incredible, insight into a very tense and conflicted life of a female tavern keeper, who's surprisingly assertive. I mean, she effectively divorced her husband. This could be done, obviously through the rabbinical court, which compels him to offer the divorce contract. But she's the one who's supporting him. He's the bum who's wandering around drinking and so on. So it's
he's definitely a bum.
You're not gonna read about this in rabbinical response in most cases. I mean, you might, but this is not our picture that we have, our nostalgic picture of Eastern Europe. But the lesson here is that women worked and were extremely capable breadwinners, sometimes exclusive breadwinners, that sort of changes the whole idea of what is patriarchy. What's this patriarchal rabbinical culture that we always hear about in Eastern Europe? Well, these women are able to, I would say, have a lot of authority by virtue of their economic experience and skill. They're able to, find these kind of modes of authority and empowerment. They're often covert. They obviously have to go to a male spiritual leader like Guttmacher or the rabbinical court to have their disputes resolved. So it's clearly a patriarchal setup, you could say, but women have a lot more autonomy and agency than we probably would have thought.
I wanted to break in really briefly. I'm Rabbi Drew, your host and founder of JewishDrinking.com. Turns out, as of this fall, the IRS has recognized Jewish Drinking as a 501c3 organization. You are always welcome to make donations. If you have any questions how to do so, you can check out the website or even simply email me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you. Now back into the show.
Also, the opposite, sometimes like a young scholar, a Torah scholar, will have just inherited a tavern, as part of his marriage agreement. And he finds here Akiva ben Kasha made only a meager living from his tavern, but had been content with his portion because it allowed him time to study Torah. So you imagine him sitting there learning, although the tavern's relatively empty, right? Unfortunately, competition from other taverns began to take its toll. Many arise against my enterprise. And if it weren't enough that my livelihood is diminished, they've also caused my Torah study to diminish. In addition, the debts that I owe are as cruel as snakes and ravens. So it's like, here you have, in contrast to that very able and powerful female tavern keeper that we talked about before, we now have a gentle scholar who is just in over his head. He doesn't have the grit that you need to run a tavern. And he says, others have said, that they can't stand to run taverns because not only can't you learn Torah in this environment, but the customers are annoying and violent, and it's no place for a Ben Torah, right? It's no place for a Torah scholar. And so think about what Daniel Boyarin wrote in his excellent pioneering study, Unheroic Conduct, where in Judaism, especially Jewish life in Eastern Europe, the gender roles are not the same. They're not the same gender expectations. The man is often, the ideal man is a gentle Torah scholar who has mental prowess, but certainly not physical prowess the way you have in Western culture. The woman, on the other hand, is tough, very able. And you just have a very different gender, which I find fascinating.
It's a different expression of gender ideals, I guess.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Jewish gender ideals or constructions are they look down upon the masculine ideal in Western culture as being somehow animalistic and beastly. And that's Esav. That's not Yaakov, right?
Yeah. Professor Dynner, this has been really fascinating, insightful. It's definitely wonderful to double click into that 12th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show here about Jewish tavern keepers in Poland in the 18th and 19th centuries. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Oh, well, thank you so much for the opportunity. As I mentioned before, I just sent off my manuscript to Oxford, which hopefully will be ready in a few months. The tentative title is The Light of Learning. The subtitle is Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust. And in this book, I really look at Hasidic learning, Torah study, and education as not only a spiritual and intellectual exercise, but also a political endeavor. It's a mode of resistance against Polish public school education and secular Jewish schooling, which has become so prominent at the time. Hasidic Jews in the wake of World War I start building yeshivas and revamping their education and become extremely rigorous in their Torah study. And that is, I think, the origin of the Hasidut we have today, which is much more intellectual and studious than the 19th century picture of miracle working and dynasties and emotional worship and so on. So it's really a study in the intellectual revolution of Hasidism in Poland in the wake of World War I.
Really fascinating. That I'm sure a lot of people find that incredibly fascinating. So I'm really curious. All right. This has been great. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much. And before we go, L'chaim.
L'chaim.